How dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. There's that dream that Bram Stoker had. Well, it's time for us to spend a night at Castle Dracula. Welcome to the Dusk Bell. Tonight we're going to be diving into chapters 2 and 3 of Dracula by Bram Stoker. So tonight we'll be using the Norton Critical Edition of Dracula. It follows the same text as the Penguin Classic version. It says this edition of Dracula is based on the original British edition, published by Archibald Constable and Company in June 1897. I have lots of copies of Dracula just for fun, so I have the Penguin Classic that we used last time. I have this edition. This one I just find pretty, and that's really how I envision the castle every time I think of it or we read about it. I have this version of Well, which I just think this one's pretty, so I don't really read it or write in it, but I have it on display in my apartment. So one thing about this text, on the front, we have this delightfully creepy image. The cover is Henry Irving as Mephistopheles in Faust. Bram Stoker actually wanted Henry Irving to play Dracula in the stage play, so he really can provide the framework for us as to what Dracula looks like. In these chapters, we're going to get a lot of description about what Dracula looks like. So we can, of course, imagine him how we wish based on the description, but as far as Bram Stoker was concerned, Henry Irving would have been a great choice to play him. So when we left off, Jonathan had just arrived at the castle, and things had been quite bizarre. If you haven't watched my breakdown of chapter 1, you can go ahead and do that to catch up and start here at chapter 2 with us. So we're still in Jonathan Harker's journal, and it's 5th May. So the driver and Jonathan arrive to Castle Dracula. The driver takes his bags out. Jonathan alights from the caleche and ends up sort of waiting at the entrance, and the driver goes down with the carriage into a passageway. And Jonathan has some time to sit and think at the doorway, because he does indicate that it takes a bit of time once the driver has left him. I stood in silence where I was, for I did not know what to do. Of bell or knocker there was no sign. Through these frowning walls and dark window openings, it was not likely that my voice could penetrate. The time I waited seemed endless, and I felt doubts and fears creep upon me. What sort of place had I come to, and among what kind of people? Let's talk about Jonathan for a bit. So far, he's really an expository character. He does have some character traits. He's really representative of the everyday Englishman at the time, the Victorian Englishman. He's young. I imagine he's in his mid to late 20s, possibly younger. I don't think Bram Stoker ever gives us an idea. He is a solicitor, so a type of lawyer, and he says this to us. Was this a customary incident in the life of a solicitor's clerk sent out to explain the purchase of a London estate to a foreigner? Solicitor's clerk. Mina would not like that. Solicitor, for just before leaving London, I got word that my examination was successful, and I am now a full-blown solicitor. So we know that Jonathan is young enough to where his career is starting to take off. He has a fiance, so yeah, mid-20s, I would say. Bram Stoker writes him as pretty smart and astute, I would say. I think in some film adaptations, he can come across as, well, bland, but also maybe a little dumb. But I don't totally get that feeling from him in the book. He's a keen observer, and he makes conclusions that seem logical most of the time. So Jonathan is waiting outside of this door, and again, he's pretty creeped out. It's very dark, and he tells us that his mind is sort of racing with all of these doubts and fears. It all seemed like a horrible nightmare to me, and I expected that I should suddenly awake and find myself at home, with the dawn struggling in through the windows, as I had now and again felt in the morning after a day of overwork. But my flesh answered the pinching test, and my eyes were not to be deceived. I was indeed awake and among the Carpathians. All I could do now was to be patient and just wait the coming of morning. So then he says, just as he came to this conclusion, he heard steps coming up from the inside of the castle to the door by which he was waiting. And then he can see a beam of light coming through the little cracks in the door, the crevices in the door. And he hears all these, the clinking sounds of the bolts and the locking devices on the door opening. And Jonathan even makes a remark that it's as if those locks had not been used in centuries. Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven, save for a long white mustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of color on him anywhere. He held in his hand an antique silver lamp, in which the flame burned without chimney or globe of any kind, throwing long quivering shadows as it flickered. The old man motioned me in with his right hand in a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English, but with a strange intonation, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will." He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed as cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead man than a living man. Again he said, "Welcome to my house. Come freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness that you bring." So we get our first description of Dracula. Bram Stoker describes him as an old man, tall, with a white mustache, clean-shaven, clad in black. So here we have our first picture of Dracula. I think most films omit the mustache, and most films omit the fact that he is an old man. Of course, in Francis Ford Coppola's film, that's not omitted. But Francis Ford Coppola also gave Dracula a butt-shaped haircut for some reason, so, I don't know that we can totally rely on his vision of Dracula either. So Dracula tells Jonathan to enter of his own free will. It seems that Bram Stoker here is invoking the folklore that vampires require... Consent is not the word, but the complicity of their victims. So, a vampire cannot enter your home without being invited. And here we get kind of that idea, but in the opposite direction. It's almost like Dracula is verbally ensuring that Jonathan is entering of his own free will. Jonathan also mentions that Dracula makes this gesture to him as he's welcoming him into his home, and that he can't really advance or come to meet Jonathan until Jonathan steps in himself. Jonathan says, "The strength of the handshake was so much akin to that which I had noticed in the driver, whose face I had not seen. For a moment I doubted if it were not the same person to whom I was speaking. So to make sure, I said interrogatively, 'Count Dracula.' He bowed in a courtly way and replied, 'I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest.' As he was speaking, he put the lamp on a bracket on the wall, and stepped out, took my luggage, and he carried it. And Jonathan says, no, you don't need to carry my luggage, it's fine. And the Count says, well, you're my guest, and my servants aren't available because the hour is late, so I will carry your luggage. So the Count leads Jonathan to his bedroom, and it's described as if it's sort of a wing. So the Count leads him to this octagonal-shaped room, and then they pass into another room, and Jonathan is relieved to see quite a lavish bedroom, and it's warmed with a log fire. And Dracula tells him that when he's ready, he can come get his supper. And so Jonathan actually says here, he says that, Dracula's being quite welcoming and quite polite with him. And so for at least this instant, his fears and worries kind of dissipate, and he feels a bit more normal again. Jonathan gives him a letter from Mr. Hawkins, who is essentially Jonathan's boss and who has sent him to Transylvania to do business with Dracula. And Dracula tells him, after reading the letter, "I much regret that an attack of gout, from which malady I am a constant sufferer, forbids absolutely any traveling on my part for some time to come. But I am happy to say that I can send a sufficient substitute, one in whom I have every possible confidence. He is a young man, full of energy and talent in his own way, and of a very faithful disposition. He is discreet and silent, and has grown into manhood in my service. He shall be ready to attend on you when you will, during his stay, and shall take your instructions in all matters." So Jonathan is finishing his supper, and Dracula has joined him and has been chatting, and Jonathan was able to give him the letter from his boss. And Dracula had told Jonathan that he doesn't sup, so he doesn't eat, a late night meal. And so he simply sits there to keep Jonathan company. And Jonathan gives us some more details about the way Dracula looks. "By this time I had finished my supper, and by my host's desire had drawn up a chair by the fire and begun to smoke a cigar which he offered me, at the same time excusing himself that he did not smoke. I had now an opportunity of observing him. His face was a very strong, aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose, and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead, and hair growing scantily round the temples, but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it, under the heavy moustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm, though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. And one thing that's interesting is that he describes Dracula as quite hairy. Most of the time, I think, when we think of Dracula, we think of someone quite clean-shaven. Now, Stoker did, at the beginning, say that Dracula is clean-cut, but it seems to me that in this description, although he's clean-cut, his body hair is quite profuse, and his hair itself atop his head is maybe a bit, well, like Stoker says, bushy. We really, I think, in just popular culture, don't associate Dracula with having bushy hair, but that is how Stoker describes it. To me, in my head, I just get a very 70s looking image of Dracula with large sideburns, lots of sort of fuzz on the face. Later, Jonathan describes, too, that his palms are sort of hairy, and so we almost get wolf-like features. In a way, Dracula is very akin to a werewolf. He has powers that we find out about in the future that will reinforce this idea. But we also have some more traditional vampire attributes, like the pointy ears, the teeth over the lips. He talks about how red the lips are. We get the idea of coursing blood and this mark of vitality. But one thing's for certain is the pallor that Jonathan talks about, that Dracula is devoid of color, pale to a point that it's almost gray or white. He says that his hands are fine and that his nails are pointy. That's pretty stereotypical of vampires nowadays, I'd say. Jonathan also seems to insinuate that he perhaps smells bad. As the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me, I could not repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which, do what I would, I could not conceal. And he says that the Count sort of notices this and gives a grim sort of smile. We get hints that the Count knows what effects he has on people. He sort of knows, he's self-aware. I do think, even though vampires are often portrayed as very alluring and seductive, it does seem to me that in other media, they can smell bad at times. If you've watched the amazing Swedish movie Let the Right One In, based on the amazing book by John Lindquist, Oscar, the main character, when he meets the main vampire in the story, notices that she smells kind of bad, and he's a child, so he's quite quick to mention it to her that she smells bad. That opens other questions about vampire lore, because it's not that they're a corpse or a dead body, they're undead. So they probably have attributes of a dead body, that being the smell, but also they're different in a way. It's not like they're a rotting corpse. They have that life or vitality in them, rather, but without life. We were both silent for a while, and as I looked towards the window, I saw the first dim streak of the coming dawn. There seemed a strange stillness over everything, but as I listened, I heard, as if from down below in the valley, the howling of many wolves. The Count's eyes gleamed, and he said, "Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make." Seeing, I suppose, some expression in my face strange to him, he added, "Ah, sir, you dwellers in the city cannot enter into the feelings of the hunter." And then Dracula rises, and he says, "All right, you must be very tired." And he says that I'll be away until tomorrow afternoon, so sleep as much as you like, go to bed, I hope you're comfortable, etc., etc. So in Jonathan's journal, it's now 7th May. And he says he slept really well. So it seems he had some reprieve from the bad sleep he had been having on his journey. Jonathan goes into the room where he had supper, and there is a full breakfast waiting for him. He says there's hot coffee. He enjoys it. It's quite late in the day. He does mention that he looks for a bell to call on the servants, but finds none, and so surmises that there are no servants around in the castle, which, for a castle of this size, at the time, Jonathan finds a bit bizarre. He also tells us a bit about what he sees, in these couple of rooms that he's been in so far. He says, "The curtains and upholstery of the chairs and sofas and the hangings of my bed are of the costliest and most beautiful fabrics, and must have been of fabulous value when they were made, for they are centuries old, though in excellent wear. But still, in none of the rooms is there a mirror. There is not even a toilet glass on my table, and I had to get the little shaving glass from my bag before I could either shave or brush my hair. I have not yet seen a servant anywhere, or heard a sound near the castle except the howling of wolves." So we get no indication of mirrors, and Jonathan mentions that he had been to Hampton Court Palace just outside of London, which, was a royal palace for many years. And he says that there, the materials and the luxury of the items were comparable to the items in Dracula's home, at least in Jonathan's bedroom, but that they did look aged, whereas in Dracula's castle, even though Jonathan knows that they're centuries old, they don't look aged, they look new. So Jonathan tells us that in the room where he's been eating, there's not really anything, except there's another door, and when he goes through it, he finds a sort of mini library, a little room filled with books. There's also a door opposite his bedroom door, and he tried to go into that one, but it was locked. So far he only has access to this little library room, his bedroom, and the room where he's been having his meals. In the library I found, to my great delight, a vast number of English books, whole shelves full of them, and bound volumes of magazines and newspapers. A table in the center was littered with English magazines and newspapers, though none of them were of very recent date. The books were of the most varied kind: history, geography, politics, political economy, botany, geology, law, all relating to England and English life and customs and manners. So Jonathan's looking at all these books. Evidently Dracula is really interested in England. Makes sense, he's moving there. And Dracula comes in. "I'm glad you found your way in here, for I'm sure there is much that will interest you. These friends," and he laid his hand on some of the books, "have been good friends to me, and for some years past, ever since I had the idea of going to London, have given me many, many hours of pleasure. Through them, I have come to know your great England, and to know her is to love her. I long to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London, to be in the midst of the whirl and rush of humanity, to share its life, its change, its death, and all that makes it what it is. But alas, as yet I only know your tongue through books. To you, my friend, I look that I know it to speak. But Count, I said, you know and speak English thoroughly. He bowed gravely. I thank you, my friend, for your all too flattering estimate, but yet I fear that I am but a little way on the road I would travel. True, I know the grammar and the words, but yet I know not how to speak them. Indeed, I said, you speak excellently. Not so, he answered. Well, I know that, did I move and speak in your London, none there are who would not know me for a stranger. That is not enough for me. So, obviously, a lot of people, when they think of Dracula, they quite rightly think of Bela Lugosi and, the Count Dracula, the very animated Romanian, Transylvanian accent. And Bela Lugosi was born in the Kingdom of Hungary, but where he was born is now modern-day Romania. And so he had an authentic accent to that area. And if you watch interviews with Bela Lugosi, he had a very elegant way of speaking in English, but he did have that accent. The way in which he speaks in the film Dracula isn't far off from his natural speaking voice in English. And so he really popularized that idea of Dracula with the thick Transylvanian accent. I can't do it very well. But here, Jonathan says that Dracula speaks excellent English, but maybe in a slightly, a different cadence. Really, I think there's no wrong interpretation here. Lots of actors who have played Dracula have been English themselves and have done English accents. Christopher Lee played Dracula with, I presume, his natural accent. He probably made acting choices. Frank Langella played Dracula. Frank Langella is American, but he spoke with an upper-class British accent when he was playing Dracula in the stage play and in the movie as well. And I think, if I remember correctly, he requested that. He said, if we're going to make the movie and if you're going to cast me as Dracula, I'm going to speak with the English accent I've been speaking with in the play. And that was done. I like thinking about this. To me, a vampire, if they've lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, they could certainly achieve native level in any language they wanted if they were interested enough. So I tend to imagine Dracula, yes, as having a cadence that is foreign, but basically as speaking perfect English with an English accent of sorts. It's interesting, if any of you have been watching the new Interview with the Vampire series, I think they're doing this. I haven't fully paid attention, but Lestat, when we first meet him, has quite a strong French accent. And then as we come into modern times, his accent, I believe Sam Reed, the actor who plays him, has diminished his French accent a bit, which I find to be an amazing attention to detail, because that would happen. Obviously, in real life, for us mortals, if we, get to bilingual level in a second language, we can speak it, quite well, maybe lose our accent entirely, but a lot of people keep their accents. But surely if you lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, and if you spoke that language for hundreds and hundreds of years, you would eventually gain the accent of whatever people you are speaking to in that language. And you could probably sound quite native. So for me, Dracula speaks some form of Southern British English at the time. But what he goes on to say is interesting. To me, it proves my point, because he doesn't seem satisfied with his level in English, but he does prove a very, very high level in English and a keen interest into speaking it correctly. So he says, "Here, in Transylvania, I'm a noble. The common people know me, and I am master. But a stranger in a strange land, he is no one. Men know him not, and to know not is to care not for. I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops if he see me, or pause in his speaking if he hear my words, to say, 'Ah, a stranger. I have been so long master that I would be master still, or at least that none other should be master of me. You come to me not alone as agent of my friend Peter Hawkins of Exeter, to tell me all about my new estate in London. You shall, I trust, rest here with me a while, so that by our talking I may learn the English intonation, and I would that you tell me when I make error, even of the smallest, in my speaking. So Dracula, when he goes to England, he says that he wants to blend in with the English people, and he doesn't want to be seen as a foreigner, especially because, as he says, he's a noble in Transylvania. And we'll find out pretty quickly in this chapter, Count Dracula, is a very proud man. He's proud of where he comes from, and he's proud of his family's lineage. And he does come from a noble family of a storied history that we're going to find out a bit about. He does talk about that in a foreign country, for him, what will be England, he doesn't want people to treat him differently, and he sort of knows that he will be treated maybe as less than if people can immediately identify him as foreign. So it's interesting, and it's a theme that's going to continue through the novel of the outsider, and Dracula does not want to be this. And in this chapter, we're also going to learn more about Dracula's motivations, not just currently while we're here at the castle with Dracula, but throughout the book, he does have some significant motivations that will reveal themselves. So Jonathan asks if he can frequent this little library room, and Dracula says, of course. You can go anywhere you want in the castle, just not into a door that is locked. And Jonathan has already found some locked doors, and he will find more. So Dracula's like, you have free reign, but if a door is locked, it means you can't go in. So, okay. And Dracula says, we are in Transylvania, and Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways, and there shall be to you many strange things. Nay, from what you have told me of your experiences already, you know something of what strange things here may be. Jonathan says that this leads to a ton of conversation, and he asks Dracula about all of the strange things that happened the previous night, notably the blue flames that Jonathan had seen. He says that Dracula, Jonathan is mentioning to him all the strange things, the townspeople acting bizarre, the wolves howling, the carriage ride. He says that Dracula entertains these questions, but usually sort of changes the subject or is somehow able to write them off. A lot of the questions he does answer. So if you recall, the landlady had told Jonathan that it was St. George's Day the previous night, and Dracula explains that because, the veil between the living and the dead is thinned, or the peasants believe it to be so, that the blue flames are meant to be indicating where long-lost treasure has been buried. And so Dracula says, the caleche driver was probably putting rocks there to mark where that was to go dig it up in the morning. But Dracula says, because your peasant is at heart a coward and a fool, those flames only appear on one night. And on that night, no man of this land will, if he can help it, stir without his doors. And dear sir, even if he did, he would not know what to do. Why, even the peasant that you tell me of, who marked the place of the flame, would not know where to look in daylight, even for his own work. He would not, I dare be sworn, be able to find these places again. Jonathan says no. Yeah, so he says that maybe the peasant was trying to mark where they were, but he won't be able to find them. He won't be able to find them in the daylight. Of course, we have a sneaking suspicion that it was actually Dracula who drove the caleche. So then Jonathan and Dracula talk about, their business dealings, and Jonathan tells him about the home he has secured for him in England, and this is Carfax. And like Dracula's castle, it's a place that seems to be quite dilapidated. Jonathan describes it as gloomy, with many trees, and there's a deep, dark-looking pond or small lake. The house is very large, and of all periods back, I should say, to medieval times, for one part is of stone immensely thick, with only a few windows high up and heavy barred with iron. It looks like the part of a keep, and is close to an old chapel or church. There are but few houses close at hand, one being a very large house only recently added to and formed into a private lunatic asylum. It is not, however, visible from the grounds. So, old, dilapidated, creepy, gloomy home next to a lunatic asylum. So Dracula is quite pleased with this. It seems to be up his alley. And he says a line that I love, and that if you've watched the 1979 version of Dracula, I think Frank Langella delivers this line exquisitely. Of course, it's kind of in a different context. They put it in a different scene than we have it here. But Dracula says, "I'm glad that it is old and big. I myself am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. A house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make up a century. I rejoice also that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles love not to think that our bones may be amongst the common dead. I seek not gaiety nor mirth, not the bright voluptuousness of much sunshine and sparkling waters which please the young and gay. I am no longer young, and my heart, through weary years of mourning over the dead, is not attuned to mirth." So basically the line that Frank Langella says is the beginning part of that passage, how few days go to make up a century. And then Dracula goes along to say that, he makes reference to his nobility, and he says that he likes to be distinguished from those who are not noble, from peasants. So we get a great deal of pride, perhaps arrogance, in Dracula, and that is certainly one of his most defining characteristics, I would say. It has a lot to do with his motivations in the book. Jonathan says, "Somehow his words and his look did not seem to accord, or else it was that his cast of face made his smile look malignant and saturnine. Presently, with an excuse, he left me, asking to put all my papers together. He was some little time away, and I began to look at some of the books around me. One was an atlas, which I found opened naturally at England, as if that map had been much used. On looking at it, I found in certain places little rings marked, and on examining these I noticed that one was near London on the east side, manifestly where his new estate was situated. The other two were Exeter, so where Peter Hawkins is, Jonathan's boss, and Whitby on the Yorkshire coast. So that will become significant later. Dracula has marked some places on the map, notably Whitby, a coastal town. So Dracula and Jonathan are staying up quite late, talking about England, Dracula's new home, English customs, manners, etc. Jonathan says, "I was not sleepy, as the long sleep yesterday had fortified me, but I could not help experiencing that chill which comes over one at the coming of the dawn, which is like, in its way, the turn of the tide. They say that people who are near death die generally at the change to the dawn or at the turn of the tide. Anyone who has, when tired, and tied as it were to his post, experienced this change in the atmosphere can well believe it." So Dracula notices that dawn has arrived and tells Jonathan, "Oh, your conversation is so interesting, but I can't believe it's morning, and I'll let you retire." Next day, Jonathan writes, "For there is something so strange about this place and all in it that I cannot but feel uneasy. I wish I were safe out of it, or that I had never come. It may be that this strange night existence is telling on me, but would that there were all. If there were anyone to talk to, I could bear it. But there is no one. I have only the Count to speak with, and I fear I am myself the only living soul within the place. Let me be prosaic so far as facts can be. It will help me to bear up, and imagination must not run riot with me. If it does, I am lost. Let me say at once how I stand, or seem to." Interestingly, in this edition of the book, we have a little note where Jonathan describes, strange nocturnal nights that says, "The word strange in late Victorian England was often suffused with homoerotic undercurrents." So whether or not Dracula can be argued as being homoerotic, I don't know, but certainly Bram Stoker set out to make Dracula seem repellent in some ways, and we'll find that sexuality and what was perceived as perverse sexuality in Victorian times is rampant with Dracula, with Dracula's castle, with anything having to do with vampirism, it's really going to become apparent that a lot of repressed Victorian sexuality manifested as horrific to the Victorians. And so usually anything sexual that arises in the novel will be described in terms both alluring and horrifying. It's rare, if not ever, that Bram Stoker describes something sensual in any manner pertaining to sexuality without also using quite negative words to describe it as well. And so we'll see that coming up. So this can probably be described as our first incident in the book with Count Dracula. Jonathan, as he had said, could find no mirrors in the castle, which to him was bizarre. So he sleeps a while, and when he gets up, he has a shaving glass in his bag, and he goes to the window of his bedroom to end shaving. And seemingly out of nowhere, the Count shows up, puts his hand on his shoulder, and says good morning. Jonathan is really startled, and so in being startled and turning to face Dracula, he cuts himself with his razor, and he says he doesn't notice this at first. As he's turning to look at Dracula, he notices that Dracula has no reflection in the mirror. When he realizes he's been cut, he turns around again, and he confirms a second time, right, I can't see this man's reflection. I can't see Dracula's reflection, because now the second time he turns, he gets confirmation that he can indeed see the whole room. So it's not just a bad angle. Truly, Dracula has no reflection. When the Count saw my face, his eyes blazed with a sort of demoniac fury, and he suddenly made a grab at my throat. I drew away, and his hand touched the string of beads which held the crucifix. It made an instant change in him, for the fury passed so quickly that I could hardly believe it was ever there. So, having cut himself, Dracula, as Jonathan says, reaches for his throat, which seems quite dramatic. It seems like this would really spook someone if this happened in real life. And it does spook Jonathan, to be sure. But Jonathan also says it happened so fast. It was such a quick altercation that he reaches for my throat, and then there's the crucifix, and so the fury passes, and Dracula is sort of repelled, that he said I wasn't even sure it had happened. And I don't know if I said this to you, but Dracula, when he had reached for Jonathan, touched the crucifix that Jonathan was wearing around his neck. And this is the crucifix that the landlady had given him in chapter 1. Dracula says, Take care. Take care how you cut yourself. It is more dangerous than you think in this country. Then, seizing the shaving glass, he went on, and this is the wretched thing that has done the mischief. I kind of think this part is really funny. Dracula says, and this is the wretched thing that has done the mischief. It is a foul bauble of man's vanity. Away with it! And opening the heavy window with one wrench of his terrible hand, he flung out the glass, which was shattered into 1,000 pieces on the stones of the courtyard far below. Then he withdrew without a word. It is very annoying, Jonathan said, for I do not see how I'm to shave, unless in my watch case or the bottom of the shaving pot, which is fortunately of metal. I don't know, that part is hilarious to me. Dracula, after the altercation happens, takes Jonathan's shaving glass, is like, oh, I'm disgusted by this bauble of man's vanity, and tosses it out the window. It shatters. And Jonathan's like, well, that's annoying. That was my mirror, man. I don't know. I find that so hilarious. And, what's interesting about the thing with Dracula having no reflection, Bram Stoker surely would have taken this from traditional vampire folklore, because in the folklore, they have no soul. And so I find it interesting to sort of think about the mechanics, I suppose, of why a vampire wouldn't have a reflection. Obviously, it's the absence of a soul, and mirrors in Transylvanian folklore were often to do with the spiritual world. So seeing yourself reflected in the mirror, it's a piece of your soul that's being reflected. To me, I think of it as the idea of your reflection in a mirror is not you. It's not your physical person. So it exists in a different plane. Whereas with vampires, there is no reflection because they exist in no other planes other than the physical and on Earth. They have no soul, so they're not engaged with the spiritual plane. They're bound, they're condemned to Earth. And so an image of them does not exist outside of what is physically there. At least that's how I think of it. But basically, they have no soul, and mirrors being associated with spirituality, they don't have a reflection in the mirror. It's interesting, there's an excerpt here in this version of the book that says, Dracula does not sup, he does not smoke, he finds mirrors vain baubles. Altogether, he is a puritanical presence, though he is often written of and filmed as sort of a liberator. His dark clothes, his obsessive memories, and his rage against human gratification sort of reflect this puritanical nature. Jonathan goes exploring after breakfast, and here is where he describes more of the castle being on a precipice. So we're really high up. You know, if you threw something off, it would fall, you wouldn't hear it land. As far as the eye can reach is a sea of green treetops with occasionally a deep rift where there is a chasm. Here and there are several threads where the rivers wind in deep gorges through the forests. But I am not in heart to describe beauty, for when I had seen the view I explored further. And here we get the ending of chapter 2. Jonathan says, doors, doors, doors everywhere, and all locked and bolted. In no place, save from the windows in the castle walls, is there an available exit. The castle is a veritable prison, and I am prisoner. All right, so let's begin chapter 3. So Jonathan's discovered that he's a prisoner, and we're going to see how he deals with this discovery. I like thinking about how I would deal with this. In some ways, I would deal with it similarly to Jonathan. Of course, I can't know for sure. But in other ways, Jonathan will deviate from how I think I might react. So Jonathan says, when I found that I was a prisoner, a sort of wild feeling came over me. I rushed up and down the stairs, trying every door and peering out of every window I could find. But after a little, the conviction of my helplessness overpowered all other feelings. When I look back after a few hours, I think I must have been mad for the time, for I behaved much as a rat does in a trap. When, however, the conviction had come to me that I was helpless, I sat down quietly as I have ever done anything in my life, and began to think over what was best to be done. I am thinking still, and as yet have come to no definite conclusion. Of one thing I am certain, that it is of no use making my ideas known to the Count. He knows well that I am imprisoned, and as he has done it himself, and has doubtless his own motives for it, he would only deceive me if I trusted him fully with the facts. So far as I can see, my only plan will be to keep my knowledge and my fears to myself, and my eyes open. I am, I know, either being deceived, like a baby, by my own fears, or else I am in desperate straits, and if the latter be so, I need, and shall need, all my brains to get through. So, of course, I think Jonathan is right in not telling Dracula, hey, why have you imprisoned me? But he does say that he ran about kind of wildly, trying to open all the doors. I don't know. I think I would be, if I came to the conclusion that I was being held prisoner, I would be more discreet, maybe. So Jonathan hears the main great door shut, and so he goes to wait in the library. And then when the Count does not immediately go there, Jonathan, kind of creeping around, actually sees the Count in his bedroom making the bed. Jonathan says, this was odd, but only confirmed what I had all along thought, that there were no servants in the house. When later I saw him through the chink of the hinges of the door laying the table in the dining room, I was assured of it. For if he does himself all these menial offices, surely it is proof that there is no one else to do them. We have a note in this edition that says, Dracula is his own servant, but a domestic self-sufficiency that charms many readers today may have looked evilly unmasculine and thus inhuman to some Victorians. I mean, what do they think poor people do. Is that unmasculine when they make their beds? Victorians. So then Jonathan comes to the conclusion that it definitely was Dracula who was the Kalesh driver, and that this is even scarier because the Kalesh driver was able to control the wolves, if you remember. He was able to hold up his hands, stop the wolves who had surrounded them. And so now he's feeling like Dracula really does have something supernatural about him, and that he has powers, and, things are creepy. Bless that good, good woman who hung the crucifix round my neck, for it is a comfort and a strength to me whenever I touch it. It is odd that a thing which I have been taught to regard with disfavor and as idolatrous should in a time of loneliness and trouble be of help. Is it that there is something in the essence of the thing itself, or that it is a medium, a tangible help, in conveying memories of sympathy and comfort? Sometime, if it may be, I must examine this matter and try to make up my mind about it. In the meantime, I must find out all I can about Count Dracula, as it may help me to understand. Tonight he may talk to himself, if I turn the conversation that way. I must be very careful, however, not to awake his suspicion. So Jonathan wonders if there's something intrinsic to the cross that makes it comforting to him, or if it's just the idea of the cross, or the crucifix rather, that is comforting. And this is interesting. Like I said at the beginning of chapter 1, the late 1800s were, it was sort of an enlightenment of sorts. We're beginning to learn much more about, medicine, psychiatry. We, of course, have the ideas of Sigmund Freud coming to the forefront. So Jonathan is really caught in between, these superstitions that he had dismissed as ridiculous in the first chapter, and now being confronted with this supernatural world. And of course, in this novel, the supernatural is true, but in a way, it does reflect the ideas of the time. People were re-examining spirituality and religion and how they interpreted it. And so Jonathan here talking about the cross sort of reflects that. Is it the thing itself, or is it the effect that it has on me that makes it comforting? So the next diary entry we get from Jonathan is at midnight, and he recounts to us the rest of his time with the Count. I've had a long talk with the Count. I asked him a few questions on Transylvanian history, and he warmed up to the subject wonderfully. Whenever he spoke of his house, he always said we, and spoke almost in the plural, like a king speaking. I wish I could put down all he said exactly as he said it, for to me it was most fascinating. It seemed to have in it a whole history of the country. He grew excited as he spoke, and walked about the room, pulling his great white moustache and grasping anything on which he laid his hands, as though he would crush it by main strength. We Seikes have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights, for lordship. Here, in the whirlpool of European races, the Ugric tribe bore down from Iceland the fighting spirit which Thor and Woden gave them, which their berserkers displayed to such fell intent on the seaboards of Europe, aye, and of Asia and Africa too, till the peoples thought that the werewolves themselves had come. Here, too, when they came, they found the Huns, whose warlike fury had swept the earth like a living flame, till the dying peoples held that in their veins ran the blood of those old witches who, expelled from Scythia, had mated with the devils in the desert. Fools, fools! What devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins? Dracula makes reference to himself and holds up his hands. Is it a wonder that we were a conquering race, that we were proud? That when the Magyar, the Lombard, the Avar, the Bulgar, or the Turk poured his thousands on our frontiers, we drove them back. So Dracula here, for a while, I won't go into it. You can read the passages. It's in chapter 3. He sort of lays out a large history of his people and his lineage. And like I said early, it's very storied. There's a lot of pride. And he seems to come from a very warrior past. And again, I think that that is a hugely important trait to Dracula and will explain a lot about him and what he does later in the novel. Now we come to 12th May in Jonathan's diary. Let me begin with facts. Bare, meager facts, verified by books and figures, and of which there can be no doubt. I must not confuse them with experiences which will have to rest on my own observation or my memory of them. So Jonathan has another conversation with Dracula, and in this conversation, Dracula asks him all about legal matters. Can I have more than one solicitor? How do I keep my affairs private? So essentially, in further conversations, Dracula really shows that he has a lot of knowledge about legal proceedings, especially in England. He's done his research, and that he wants to keep his affairs private. That's paramount to Dracula. And so he asks Jonathan lots of hypothetical questions, but questions that we can see Dracula would like answered for his next moves. Basically, Dracula says, I could be at liberty to direct myself. Is it not so? Asking if he can have multiple solicitors. And Jonathan says, of course, and such is often done by men of business who do not like the whole of their affairs to be known by any one person. Good, Dracula said. Have you written since your first letter to our friend Mr. Peter Hawkins, or to any other? It was with some bitterness in my heart that I answered that I had not. Then write now, my young friend, he said, laying a heavy hand on my shoulder. Write to our friend and to any other, and say, if it will please you, that you shall stay with me until a month from now. Do you wish me to stay so long? I asked, for my heart grew cold at the thought. I desire it much, nay, I will take no refusal. When your master, employer, what he will, engaged that someone should come on his behalf, it was understood that my needs only were to be consulted. I have not stinted, is it not so? And Jonathan says, what could I do but bow acceptance? It was Mr. Hawkins' interest, not mine, and I had to think of him, not myself, and besides, while Count Dracula was speaking, there was that in his eyes and in his bearing which made me remember that I was a prisoner, and that if I wished it, I could have no choice. The Count saw his victory in my bow, and his mastery in the trouble of my face, for he began at once to use them, but in his own smooth, resistless way. I pray you, my good friend, that you will not discourse of things other than business in your letters. It will doubtless please your friends to know that you are well, and that you look forward to getting home to them. Is it not so? So Dracula gives Jonathan the means to write these business letters, and Jonathan comes to the conclusion that later he will try to find a way to disclose more to Mina, his fiancée, and to his boss, Peter Hawkins, but that for now he's just going to write the strictly business letters that Dracula has asked of him. So he's trying to keep things on the down low. And of course, Dracula has asked him to stay for a month more, and Jonathan finds this thought unbearable, but basically has to accept. So you have to imagine, too, we talked at the beginning of chapter 2 about how Jonathan, he's a young man, and his career is starting off. He's just been promoted, but he's still sort of at the bottom of the ladder. And so I can't help but feel a little bit bad from him here, because basically it's the perfect storm that he is young and trying to prove himself, and that he gets stuck with this voyage to Transylvania and this increasingly weird, bizarro client that is Count Dracula. All right, so far we've had a lot of setup in these chapters, a lot of discussions. We've met Dracula. I would wager to say that now we're going to start getting into some action. So Dracula once again leaves Jonathan all alone and says, let me advise you, my dear young friend, nay, let me warn you with all seriousness, that should you leave these rooms, you will not by any chance go to sleep in any other part of the castle. It is old, and has many memories, and there are bad dreams for those who sleep unwisely. Be warned, should sleep now or ever overcome you, or be like to do, then haste to your own chamber or to these rooms, for your rest will then be safe. But if you be not careful in this respect, then... He finished his speech in a gruesome way, for he motioned with his hands as if he were washing them. I quite understood. My only doubt was as to whether any dream could be more terrible than the unnatural, horrible net of gloom and mystery which seemed closing around me. So basically, the gesture of washing the hands that Dracula gives him is, look, if you fall asleep outside of your chambers, outside of your little wing here, bad things will happen, things that I will have to cover up, that I cannot fix, etc., etc. Jonathan places a crucifix on the top of his bed, so now Jonathan is in total fear mode if we hadn't gathered that he was before. All right, now, things are going to get interesting. When he left me, I went to my room. After a little while, not hearing any sound, I came out and went up the stone stair to where I could look out towards the south. There was some sense of freedom in the vast expanse, inaccessible though it was to me, as compared with the narrow darkness of the courtyard. Now, this is where Jonathan is going to start doing things that I definitely would not do in his situation. That being said, maybe we can explain it away. He does indicate to us that, he had been growing very disoriented because of this nocturnal existence, being around at night, being confined to his quarters. So perhaps too, he's experiencing some stir craziness and some distress that I can't relate to at the moment. But he does start getting a bit reckless. If it were me, if I were in Jonathan's shoes, I would not be leaving my quarters, and I would be making it my mission to become BFFs with Dracula, because insofar as he likes me or needs me, hopefully he won't hurt me. Jonathan says, when he left me, I went to my room. After a little while, not hearing any sound, I came out and went up the stone stair to where I could look out towards the south. God knows that there is ground for any terrible fear in this accursed place. I looked out over the beautiful expanse, bathed in soft yellow moonlight, till it was almost as light as day. In the soft light, the distant hills became melted, and the shadows in the valleys and gorges of velvety blackness. The mere beauty seemed to cheer me. There was peace and comfort in every breath I drew. As I leaned from the window, my eye was caught by something moving a story below me, and somewhat to my left, where I imagined, from the lie of the rooms, that the windows of the Count's own room would look out. So Jonathan's sense of peace is not going to last very long. I would summarize this to you myself, but Stoker does such a good job, so let's continue reading. What I saw was the Count's head coming out from the window. I did not see the face, but I knew the man by the neck and the movement of his back and arms. In any case, I could not mistake the hands which I had had so many opportunities of studying. I was at first interested and somewhat amused, for it is wonderful how small a matter will interest and amuse a man when he is a prisoner. But my very feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. At first I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow, but I kept looking, and it could be no delusion. I saw the fingers and toes grasp the corners of the stones, worn clear of the mortar by the stress of years, and by thus using every projection and inequality move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along a wall. This is truly a creepy image. This part definitely is cut from a lot of Dracula movies. Jonathan has known that Count Dracula is an eerie, odd, peculiar man, but this is really the first monstrous occurrence of Dracula. I would say even more so than the lunging for his neck with the crucifix, because this is when we see that he really is not a man. And it's interesting too that Stoker describes him as having lizard attributes. Obviously in film adaptations and in popular culture, I say obviously, I don't know, but I don't think that we really associate lizardness with Dracula. Usually he's more elegant and more human-like. We think of a nobleman, and we do as well in the book, but this is truly, we see a more primal side to Dracula. So obviously with his fingers and toes helping him scale down the wall, he's barefoot for one. So usually he's not depicted as barefoot in movies. But also this is very animalistic. In the 1979 version of Dracula, which I love, and I believe in the 1992 version, Well, the 1992 version, I think, is more like the book. But in the 1979 version, Dracula, when he's crawling down the wall, it is very creepy because it's very uncanny, but it's almost more like he's floating and kind of gracefully, one arm after the other crawling down the wall. It's almost like a graceful dance. Here, it's described much more as, an animal who's adapted to do this, like his fingers and toes curling and going into the wall. If you've seen Let the Right One In, I believe in 2008, the Swedish version, based on the novel by John Lindquist, I think I already mentioned it in this video, there is a scene after our main vampire makes a kill where she's in a tree, and they edit it in such a cool... The special effects in that movie are extremely subtle. I believe it had a limited budget, but extremely effective. She's sitting in a tree, and we can almost... Her hands are edited to look more like claws, and that's how I imagine it here, the way Bram Stoker described it. So, great vampire movie, Let the Right One In. And in that one, we kind of get this, to me, the image in my head of, those feet extending like claws, being able to grip things, and the hands as well. What manner of man is this? Or what manner of creature is it in the semblance of man? I feel the dread of this horrible place overpowering me. I am in fear, awful fear, and there is no escape for me. I am encompassed about with terrors that I dare not think of. Now we're going to get into our biggest scare thus far, I think. So Jonathan now knows he's a prisoner in a monster's castle, and he's freaking out, to say the least. 15th May. So 3 days have passed. And Jonathan has now grown accustomed to watching the Count go out in this lizard fashion. Jonathan seems confident this night that the Count has left the castle, and so he decides to take advantage of this time to explore more. Again, would I do this? Probably not, but sure, Jonathan, let's do it. So he's going through the castle with a lamp, and he's trying various doors. And he goes to the main doors in the great hall in which he entered and tries to open those. Those are locked. And he surmises that the key must be kept in the Count's room, and so he makes a mental note that at one point maybe that's where he could get the key to get out, is the Count's room. He stumbles upon a couple of rooms where there's nothing but old furniture, but eventually he comes to a door at the top of a stair. At last, however, I found one door at the top of a stairway which, though it seemed to be locked, gave a little under pressure. I was now in a wing of the castle further to the right than the rooms I knew, and a story lower down. From the windows I could see that the suite of rooms lay along to the south of the castle, the windows of the end room looking out both west and south. On the latter side, as well as to the former, there was a great precipice. The castle was built on a corner of a great rock, and great windows were placed here where sling or bow or culverin could not reach. So basically he comes to this wing where there are huge windows, and the place is totally illuminated by moonlight, and he says that you can see west and south, so he has this great expanse of a view outside of the castle. To the west was a great valley, and then rising far away, great jagged mountain fastnesses, rising peak on peak, the sheer rock studded with mountain ash and thorn, whose roots clung in cracks and crevices and crannies of the stone. This was evidently a portion of the castle occupied in bygone days, for the furniture had more air of comfort than any I had seen. The windows were curtainless, and the yellow moonlight, flooding in through the diamond panes, enabled one to see even colors, whilst it softened the wealth of dust which lay over all and disguised in some measure the ravages of time and the moth. My lamp seemed to be of little effect in the brilliant moonlight, but I was glad to have it with me, for there was a dread loneliness in the place which chilled my heart and made my nerves tremble. Still, it was better than living alone in the rooms which I had come to hate from the presence of the Count. So, Jonathan's being a little stupid here, but I can forgive it because he says that he is going crazy, and with the castle having lots of supernatural stuff going on, Sure, maybe he's being a little bit affected, and so he has to, go roaming into places where he shouldn't be. That being said, he's about to do something real stupid that I don't know that I can excuse. And we know that he's done something real stupid because the journal stops and our next entry is later, the morning of 16th May. So now it's the morning. And Jonathan is going to tell us what happened after he happened upon this other wing of the castle. The Count's mysterious warning frightened me at the time. It frightens me more now when I think of it, for in future he has a fearful hold upon me. I shall fear to doubt what he may say. So Jonathan was kind of hanging out in this new wing of the castle, and he writes, "When I had written in my diary and had fortunately replaced the book and pen in my pocket, I felt sleepy." You know what's coming. The Count's warning came into my mind, but I took a pleasure in disobeying it. The sense of sleep was upon me, and with it the obstinacy which sleep brings as outrider. The soft moonlight soothed, and the wide expanse without gave a sense of freedom which refreshed me. I determined not to return tonight to the gloom-haunted rooms, but to sleep here. So he falls asleep on a couch. I suppose I must have fallen asleep. I hope so, but I fear, for all that followed was startlingly real. So real that now, sitting here in the broad, full sunlight of the morning, I cannot in the least believe that it was all sleep. I was not alone. So Jonathan falls asleep on a couch in this wing, and horror ensues. The room was the same, unchanged in any way since I came into it. I could see along the floor, in the brilliant moonlight, my own footsteps marked where I had disturbed the long accumulation of dust. In the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women. Ladies, by their dress and manner. I thought at the time that I must be dreaming when I saw them, for though the moonlight was behind them, they threw no shadow on the floor. So again, no shadow. So like no reflection in the mirror, there is no existence of the person that exists outside of the vampire because they don't have a soul. So we know he's happened upon 3 vampires. He describes them as ladies. He says that 2 had dark complexions, dark hair. 1 had a light complexion, light hair. And that in the moonlight their eyes seemed almost red. All 3 had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing, and at the same time, some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It is not good to note this down, lest someday it should meet Nina's eyes and cause her pain, but it is the truth. They whispered together, and then they all 3 laughed, such a silvery, musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound never could have come through the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable, tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. The fair girl shook her head coquettishly, and the other 2 urged her on. So, we have happened upon Dracula's brides, and this is a very interesting scene. This is a scene with a lot of sensual and sexual undertone, obviously in many Dracula movies after the 1931 movie. Directors will capitalize on this moment to make this as salacious and pornographic as possible. And it is, it's true. There are a lot of sexual undertones in this scene, but Bram Stoker certainly writes them with some reticence because we are in the Victorian era. And remember that everything sexual in this book is also supposed to be horrifying. It is also worth noting that Jonathan describes them as ladies. They are wraith-like, ghostly vampiresses, but we definitely aren't getting the pornographic display that we get in a lot of Dracula movies. So to me, I love this version because it remains eerie and it's going to become sensual, but it isn't overplayed. We also hear the women speak. Oftentimes in movies, any lines they have are cut. So even though they do come across in the novel as minions, they also have lines. They have a bit more than what we're usually given in movies. Go on. You're first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin. The other added, he is young and strong. There are kisses for us all. I lay quiet, looking out under my eyelashes in an agony of delightful anticipation. So like I said earlier, everything's going to be described negatively, positively, in the way of sensuality, delightful agony. The fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying the sweet, a bitter offensiveness, as one smells in blood. It's interesting because you can kind of imagine something smelling sweet, but then if you've ever smelt blood or, had an injury in your mouth, you know that it can taste quite metallic. And I feel like that's a very visceral description, and I can sort of imagine that, the mix of sweet and foul. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head, as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin, and seemed about to fasten on my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue, as it licked her teeth and lips, and could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth, just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. So it's interesting. Everything here that's being described is really animalistic. The licking of the lips, it's almost like as she bends over him, she's smelling him. And of course, everything has a double sexual entendre. And Jonathan clearly doesn't know what to do with himself. He's super excited, but he's also super terrified. So there's that. And then they get interrupted. But at that instant, another sensation swept through me as quick as lightning. I was conscious of the presence of the Count, and of his being as if lapped in a storm of fury. I saw his strong hand grasp the slender neck of the fair woman, and with giant's power draw it back, the blue eyes transformed with fury, the white teeth champing with rage. And the fair cheeks blazing red with passion. With a fierce sweep of his arm, he hurled the woman from him, and then motioned to the others, as though he were beating them back. Back, vampire women! Back! How dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. There's that dream that Bram Stoker had. The fair girl, with a laugh of coquetry, turned to answer him. You yourself never loved. You never loved. On this the other women joined, and such a mirthless, hard, soulless laughter rang through the room that it almost made me faint to hear. It seemed like the pleasure of fiends. Then the Count turned, after looking at my face attentively, and said in a soft whisper, Yes, I too can love. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is it not so? Well, now I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go. Go. I must awaken him, for there is work to be done. And then one of the vampiresses speaks. Are we to have nothing tonight? said one of them, with a low laugh as she pointed to the bag which he had thrown upon the floor, and which moved as though there was some living thing within it. For answer, he nodded his head. One of the women jumped forward and opened. If my ears did not deceive me, there was a gasp and a low wail, as of a half-smothered child. This part is truly horrifying. The women closed round, whilst I was aghast with horror, but as I looked they disappeared, and with them the dreadful bag. There was no door near them, and they could not have passed me without my noticing. They simply seemed to fade into the rays of the moonlight and pass out through the window, for I could see outside the dim shadowy forms for a moment before they entirely faded away. Then the horror overcame me, and I sank down unconscious. So we can understand that there was a baby in the bag that Dracula gave them. So really this moment is horrific. Again, Jonathan only he sort of hears something that he thinks maybe is a baby, and he doesn't get to see it clearly before it is swept away by the vampire women. In the 1931 movie, it's not shown. There's just a creepy moment with the brides, and also the moment with the brides is kind of toned down. They sort of just loom over Jonathan, and then Dracula comes and beats them back. You also have the 1979 Dracula, where this entire opening sequence with Jonathan at the castle is skipped over, and we start when Dracula comes to England. And then you have movies like Francis Ford Coppola's movie, where this turns into like a full-on near pornographic film, and it's totally different from the book. As we go through the book, I am going to make reference to a lot of Dracula films because I love vampire media. Look, the Francis Ford film is on its own a great film. It's an entertaining film. I definitely will watch it again in the future. But oh my gosh, as an interpretation of Bram Stoker's work, I have a lot of issues with it, and I'm not going to be able to hide it. And this scene in his film is, to me, bordering on absurd. Here's the reason why it doesn't work for me. It's not because I'm a prude. It's not because I'm against having a sexy scene in a movie. The reason it doesn't work for me is because we can tell that the vampire woman, though she's arousing Jonathan, bending over him, licking her lips, everything that she does is such that an animal would do before they're about to lunge on their prey. Of course, we can surmise that an attribute of vampires is that they appear seductive to their victim in order to make it easier to prey upon them. There's a lot of sexuality to vampires, but make no mistake, the woman who was hovering above Jonathan was trying to bite his neck and suck his blood. She wasn't trying to sleep with him. Of course, she uses her allure to make it easier for her to prey upon him, which is why Jonathan, although fearful, is also quite clearly sexually aroused. But, of course, everyone will have a different interpretation. Jonathan talks about the guilt he feels that he wouldn't want his fiancée Mina to read this journal. We're going to meet her soon, and she's also going to have her own relationship to sexuality, and we'll see how it plays out among these characters. But we're getting into the good stuff. We're getting into the really eerie, scary stuff. And so the book is only going to ramp up from here. Also, feel free to like and leave a comment. Let me know how I'm doing. This is only my second video. And, if you want me to read more, if you want to hear more of my commentary, let me know. I'm open to constructive criticism. So, if you're also obsessed with vampires, let me know. Tell me, because we're probably kindred spirits. Thank you so much for watching. The dusk bell has tolled, and I will see you guys in the next video.